Welcome back to Justice Insight Cam. We bring you unfiltered, real-world police interactions recorded straight from body cameras. Moving beyond the video, we analyze the facts, legal boundaries, and critical takeaways from each case. Let us explore the reality of justice.
Hey, what are you doing?
Taking my trash out. I live here.
You don't live here. Show me your ID.
The night it happened, the street was so quiet you could hear the plastic wheels of a trash bin whispering over asphalt. A porch light flickered on, then off again, like someone had second thoughts about being seen. And in the pale wash of a street lamp, a man in a dark hoodie pulled his bin to the curb the way millions of people do every week, half awake, thinking about nothing, trying to finish one small chore before the next day started. He didn't know a patrol car was already turning the corner. He didn't know the officer inside had already decided what he was looking at, and he definitely didn't know that a single sentence, 6 words, said with calm certainty, was about to turn a trash run into a civil rights case. You don't live here? Not a question, not even suspicion. A verdict. And in the months that followed, that verdict would cost a city $750,000. But the money isn't the real story. The real story is what it feels like to be told you don't belong in the place you pay taxes in, the place you mow the lawn in, the place you raise your family in. Because in Maple Grove Estates, on a forested edge of a mid-sized American city, one ordinary night revealed something that had been hiding in plain sight. And it all started with a trash bin. The man's name was Darnell Reed. He was 38, an IT project manager, with the kind of work life that made him forget what day it was sometimes. Meetings that ran long, deadlines that never cared about dinner plans, a phone that buzzed until it stopped feeling like his. Darnell and his wife, Aisha, had moved to Maple Grove Estates 2 years earlier. They didn't move there because it was trendy. They moved there because it was quiet. A cul-de-sac, good schools, trees thick enough to make the air feel cleaner, a backyard big enough for their 8-year-old son, Miles, to play without the constant sound of traffic. The neighborhood sold itself as family first. There was an HOA newsletter with smiling couples and seasonal reminders. There were weekend dog walkers who nodded without knowing your name. There were Halloween decorations in October that looked almost coordinated, the kind of place people describe as safe. Darnell liked that word. Safe meant you could exhale. It meant you could stop scanning faces in parking lots. It meant you could be boring, and after years of apartment living and long commutes, boring felt like a reward. But there's a version of safe that only applies to certain people, and you don't always find that out on the day you sign the closing documents. Sometimes you find out on a random Tuesday night when you roll a trash bin to the curb and a police officer treats you like an intruder. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. City, state, country. Because whether you live in a big city or a small town, you've probably seen a moment like this, or felt one. And if you believe everyday people should never have to prove they belong in their own neighborhood, hit like and subscribe. Stories like this don't stay visible unless we keep talking about them. Trash night in Maple Grove Estates was Wednesday, but Darnell always did it late Tuesday, not because he was lazy, because he was tired. That night, he'd worked through a project rollout that refused to behave. The kind of work where you fix one thing and 2 other things break, and you keep your voice calm while your brain turns into static. By the time he shut his laptop, the house was dim. Miles was asleep. Aisha was upstairs reading. Darnell looked at the kitchen and saw the trash can full, and the little irritation in his head said, "Just do it now." So he pulled on a hoodie, slipped his phone in his pocket, and went outside. The air was cold enough to wake you up. The trees lining the street made the neighborhood feel like it was sitting inside a dark, quiet bowl. Darnell rolled the bin down the driveway, wheels clacking, lid rattling softly. He wasn't thinking about race. He wasn't thinking about police. He was thinking about coffee in the morning. And then he saw the headlights, a patrol car moving slow, not speeding, not responding to anything, just cruising. The car slowed even more as it reached Darnell's driveway. It stopped, the engine idled, and for a second, Darnell wondered if there'd been an accident nearby, if the officer needed directions. Then the driver's door opened. A white man stepped out in a uniform, hand already resting near his belt. He didn't say hello. He didn't say good evening. He didn't ask if everything was okay. He said, "What are you doing?" Darnell blinked. "Taking my trash out," he said, because the answer was literally in his hands. The officer stared at him like that answer didn't compute. "What address do you live at?" Darnell's shoulders tightened. "Right there," he said, nodding toward the house. The officer's eyes flicked to the front porch, the dark windows, the quiet. Then he said it. "You don't live here." Darnell let out a short breath, half disbelief, half warning. "I do live here," he said, voice still controlled. The officer took a step closer. "ID," he said. Darnell didn't move. "Why?" he asked, and this is where the entire night changed, because there's a difference between a conversation and an order. There's a difference between suspicion and certainty, and there's a difference between policing and humiliation. The officer's name was Travis Keene. He'd been on the department for 9 years. Locals knew him as proactive, the kind of word departments use like a compliment. Keene repeated himself. "Show me your ID." Darnell felt his heart pick up speed, not panic, not fear in the movie sense, though that other fear, the kind that says, "This can go sideways fast." He reached for his phone, not to call someone, to record. The screen lit up in his palm, bright in the dark. The officer noticed. "What are you doing with your phone?" "Recording," Darnell said. "You're not going to record me," Keene snapped. Darnell's voice stayed steady. "I'm on my property," he said. "I'm taking out my trash. I'm recording for my safety." There was a pause. In that pause, you could feel the neighborhood holding its breath. A curtain shifted in a nearby window. A porch light across the street clicked on. Keene looked around, then back at Darnell, and then he did what officers do when they want control you more than clarity. He escalated. "Turn around," Keene said. Darnell froze. "What? Turn around, in hands behind your back." A lot of people watching later would say the same thing. He was taking out trash. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't running. He wasn't threatening. So why the handcuffs? Because the point wasn't safety. The point was compliance. Darnell took one step back. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said. "I live here." Keene moved faster. He grabbed Darnell's wrist. Darnell instinctively pulled away, not to fight, but because sudden touch triggers the body. Keene's voice jumped. "Stop resisting!" And in that instant, the whole interaction rebranded itself. Not in reality, in the report that could be written later. Keene forced Darnell's arms behind his back. Metal cuffs clicked. Cold, hard, final. Darnell's phone, still recording, captured his voice changing. Not screaming, but sharper. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded. Keene leaned in. "Because you don't live here," he said again, like repeating it would make it true. Darnell stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Then, from inside the house, a light turned on. Aisha's silhouette appeared at the window. She saw the patrol car. She saw her husband in handcuffs. And in the next seconds, she ran to the front door. Aisha stepped onto the porch in pajamas and a robe, barefoot on cold concrete. "What is happening?" she called out. Keene didn't look at her. He focused on Darnell. "What's your name?" Darnell gave it. Keene asked again, like he didn't trust the answer. Then he said, "Who are you?" to Aisha. "My name is Aisha Reed," she said, voice controlled but tight. "That's my husband. That is our home." Keene's eyes flicked to her, then back. Where's your ID? Aisha looked at him. You need my ID to prove I live in my house? Keen's voice hardened. Yes. Aisha went inside and returned with her wallet, holding it out. Keen barely glanced. He asked for Darnell's ID too. Darnell couldn't reach it with cuffs. Aisha retrieved it from the kitchen drawer, because in a family that plans for normal life, IDs end up in drawers. She held it out. Keen looked at it. He looked at the house. He looked at the trash bin. And still, he didn't unlock the cuffs. Instead, he said, "Dispatch is going to confirm." Confirm what? That a black man in a hoodie, taking out trash in his own driveway, actually lived there? That's when the first neighbor walked outside. An older white man in slippers. He stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching like it was late-night TV. A second neighbor opened a garage door halfway and peered out. No one approached. No one spoke. Not at first, because people in quiet neighborhoods don't like noise, and some of them don't like conflict, especially when the conflict would require them to choose a side. Keen's radio crackled. He called in the address. He said, "I've got a suspicious male, says he lives here." Suspicious, a word that can hold anything. Aisha looked at her husband's wrists. The cuffs were tight. His hands were beginning to redden. "Officer," she said, "he lives here. We can show you—" Keen cut her off. "Ma'am, step back." Aisha's voice rose. "I'm on my property. That's my husband." Keen put his hand up like a stop sign. Step back. This is the moment that many people later said they felt it. That shift. And when the fear isn't just about inconvenience, it's about what can happen if the officer decides you're not cooperative. Aisha stepped back, but her eyes stayed locked on him. And now Darnell, still recording, asked the question that would echo later. "Why did you assume I don't live here?" Keen didn't answer directly. He said, "This neighborhood's had break-ins." Darnell nodded. "So you stop everyone taking out trash?" Keen's jaw tightened, and that's when a new voice entered the scene. From across the street, a woman called out, "Officer, that's Darnell. He lives there." It was Mrs. Collins, a neighbor who'd spoken to Aisha at the mailbox before. She stepped onto her driveway in a sweater, looking uncomfortable but determined. Keen glanced at her. Then he looked back at Darnell. Still, the cuffs stayed on. Because the cuffs were never about uncertainty. They were about authority. After what felt like an eternity but was probably 8 minutes, dispatch came back. "Address checks out, registered to read." Keen's posture changed, not apologetic, more like annoyed, like the world had inconvenienced him. He unlocked the cuffs, metal released. Darnell's hands dropped, stiff and tingling. Aisha moved to him immediately. "Are you okay?" she whispered. Darnell flexed his wrists. He looked at Keen, and Keen said, "Be careful next time. It's late." That was it. Not, "I'm sorry," not, "my mistake," just a warning, like Darnell had done something wrong by existing at the wrong hour. Keen turned, walked back to his car, and drove away. And as his taillights disappeared, Maple Grove Estates returned to quiet. But Darnell didn't, because he couldn't. The next morning, Darnell went to work with a bruise of adrenaline still sitting in his chest. People imagine these incidents end when the officer leaves, but the incident continues. It continues in the way you hesitate before stepping outside. It continues in the way you watch headlights differently. It continues in the way your son asks, "Why were the police here?" And you have to choose between honesty and terror. Miles asked that question at breakfast. Aisha tried to keep her voice calm. "Daddy was fine," she said. "There was a misunderstanding." Miles frowned. "But why did they put those things on him?" Darnell looked at his son. He wanted to tell him the truth. He also wanted to protect him from the weight of that truth. So he did the thing so many parents do. He edited. Sometimes people make assumptions," Darnell said. And sometimes you have to stand up for yourself. Miles stared at him. Did you do something bad? Darnell shook his head. No, I didn't do anything bad. And the pain in his voice wasn't about the cuffs. It was about the fact that he needed to say it. Because in a healthy society, a kid shouldn't have to ask if taking out trash is a crime. By lunchtime, Darnell had watched his own video 3 times. Not because he wanted to, because he couldn't believe it happened, and because the human brain, when it gets hit with something unfair, replays the moment like it's trying to find the logic. There was no logic, so Darnell did what more and more people do now. He filed a complaint, he called the police department's non-emergency line, and asked how to report misconduct. Yet the person on the phone sounded tired, like they'd done this before. Darnell submitted the complaint. He requested the Bodycam footage. He requested the incident report. He asked for Keen's badge number, and for a few days, nothing happened. Then an email arrived. It said the department was reviewing. It said they took allegations seriously. It said they would follow up. It sounded like language that was designed to close the case without touching it. And that's when Aisha said something simple. We need a lawyer. Darnell hesitated. Because lawyers mean escalation. Lawyers mean you're admitting it's big. And part of him still wanted it to be small. Just a bad night. Just a mistake. Then he looked at his wrists. He looked at his son. And he realized something. If you let it be small, the next person gets cuffed faster. So he made the call. The attorney they met was named Gail Thompson. She didn't wear a dramatic suit. She wore practical shoes and had the kind of calm that comes from seeing too much. She watched Darnell's video once. Then she said, "Okay, let's talk about what matters." Not feelings, not arguments, facts. She asked, "Did the officer have a lawful reason to detain you?" Darnell described the conversation. He described the certainty, the lack of explanation, the handcuffs, the neighbor who had to vouch for him. Gail nodded. Then she asked, "Did he write a report?" Darnell said he didn't know yet. Gail leaned back. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. "These cases aren't just about what happened. They're about what gets documented. Because documentation is where reality gets translated, and sometimes it gets rewritten. Gail filed public records requests. She requested Bodycam. She requested dispatch audio. She requested any prior complaints against Keen. And then she did something else. She asked the neighborhood question that people hate. Was this about race? Darnell didn't want to answer, not because he didn't know, because naming it makes it real, and real things demand action. He finally said, "What else would it be?" Gail didn't argue. She just nodded. "Okay," she said. "Then we treat it like what it is." In the weeks that followed, Darnell learned an ugly truth. Departments don't like releasing footage that makes them look bad. Sometimes they delay. Sometimes they redact. Sometimes they claim exemptions. Sometimes they quietly hope you'll get tired. But Darnell didn't get tired. He got focused, because now he'd tasted the feeling of being erased in real time, and he refused to let that be the story. A month later, the Bodycam footage arrived. When Gail played it, Darnell watched himself from the officer's perspective. A man rolling a trash bin. A phone lifted calmly. A voice asking why. And then Keen's voice, louder on the camera. "He doesn't live here." You could hear the certainty. You could hear the irritation. And you could hear something else. Not fear, not urgency. Just assumption. Gail paused the footage. "Do you see what I see?" she asked. Darnell swallowed. "Yeah," he said. He decided before he asked. Gail nodded. "That's the case," she said. This is where the story usually splits. Some people, hearing this, say, "Well, police have to check." Others say, "This is exactly the problem. So let me ask you, if you were in Darnell's driveway, hands cuffed behind your back, neighbors watching, would you call it a check or would you call it a violation? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them, and they tell you a lot about what people think safety really means. The lawsuit wasn't filed immediately. First, there were meetings. There was a response from the department. The officer acted within policy. There was an internal affairs interview where Darnell answered questions like he was being tested. There was a quiet suggestion, never stated outright, that he should just move on. But Gail didn't move on. She built. She pulled city policies on stop and identify. She pulled training materials. She asked for Keen's activity logs. She found that Keen had a pattern of suspicious person stops in certain neighborhoods, not proof by itself. But when combined with the footage, it painted a picture of an officer who treated presence as probable cause. And then, something small but important happened. Another resident reached out, a teenage boy who lived 3 streets over. He told Gail that Keen had stopped him once while he was walking a dog, asked him who he was, where he lived, why he was in the area. It hadn't made the news, it hadn't become a case, because he'd complied, been embarrassed, and went home. That's how patterns survive. They survive in silence. Gail added the statement to the file. Then she did what civil rights attorneys do when a city refuses to admit anything. She made it expensive. Depositions began. City attorneys sat across from Darnell in a conference room with soft carpet and bottled water. They asked him about his tone. They asked why he recorded. They asked if he understood the officer was doing his job. And Darnell answered calmly. He explained that recording was protection. He explained that the officer never gave a reason. He explained that being handcuffed for a trash run isn't a misunderstanding. It's a message. Then Keen was deposed, and this is where the word suspicious gets tested. Keen said he saw a male in dark clothing near a home. He said the neighborhood had break-ins. He said Darnell's behavior was evasive. Gail asked, what was evasive? Keen said, he questioned me. Gail didn't react. She asked, so asking why you need ID is evasive. Keen shifted. He said, he pulled out a phone. Gail asked, so recording is suspicious? Keen said, it can be. Gail then played the footage. She paused at the moment Keen said, you don't live here. She asked, what made you say that? Keen hesitated. He spoke about intuition. Gail leaned forward. Intuition, she repeated, like she wanted him to hear himself. Because intuition is a word that can hide bias. It's a word that sounds harmless, but in practice it can be deadly. Keen tried to pivot. Gail didn't let him. She asked, did you stop any other residents taking out trash that week? Keen said he didn't recall. Gail asked for records. The city's attorney objected. But objections don't erase questions. They just delay answers. And the answers, eventually, came in the form of numbers and patterns, stops, warnings, contacts, a disproportionate focus in certain areas. The city could keep fighting, or it could settle. Meanwhile, the neighborhood reacted. Some neighbors avoided eye contact. Some offered quiet support. Mrs. Collins brought Aisha a casserole and whispered, I'm so sorry. Others said things like, at least he didn't hurt you, which is a sentence that sounds like comfort until you realize what it implies. At least, as if the baseline expectation had already been lowered. One HOA meeting got tense. A resident said, we don't want crime. Aisha replied, neither do we, but that doesn't justify what happened. Someone else said, the officer was just doing his job. Darnell looked around the room and realized something. For some people, the officer's job was protecting them. For others, the officer's job was policing their right to belong. The Reeds started using their garage more, not because they had to, because a driveway no longer felt like a neutral space. Darnell started checking the street before walking outside. Aisha started keeping her phone charged at all times. They didn't call it fear, they called it being smart. but the body knows what it is. It's a quiet, constant vigilance, a tax you pay without receipts. Settlement talks began 9 months after the incident. No public apology, no press conference, just emails and phone calls, and a city's risk management team doing math. Gail Thompson walked Darnell and Aisha through the options. A trial would mean a courtroom, cross-examination, public attention, a chance to force accountability, also a chance to lose. Because juries are unpredictable, and cities know how to exploit doubt. A settlement would mean money, confidentiality clauses, carefully worded statements that avoid the words racism and wrongdoing. It would mean closure, but not necessarily justice. Darnell sat with that. He didn't want to profit. He wanted to correct. He wanted the officer to learn. He wanted the department to change. He wanted his son to never see that scene again. Gail said, "Sometimes money is the only language a city listens to." Darnell hated that, because it felt transactional, like his humiliation could be priced. And then he remembered the neighbors watching. He remembered the cuffs. He remembered the certainty in Keen's voice, and he realized this wasn't just about him. It was about precedent. The city offered $200,000. Gail countered. They went back and forth. Numbers moved. The city tried to frame it as a misunderstanding. Gail framed it as a constitutional violation. Then one day, Gail called Darnell. "They want to settle," she said. $750,000. Darnell sat down. Aisha looked at him, searching his face. "Do we take it?" she asked. And that question, "Do we take it?" carried years of history. Because when you're treated unfairly, you don't just want compensation. You want recognition, you want an apology, you want someone to say, "That was wrong." But cities don't like saying that. They like closing files. Darnell asked Gail, "What else is in the agreement?" Gail said there would be policy review language, training commitments, a requirement for the department to update certain stop procedures. Not a guarantee, but a lever. Aisha took Darnell's hand. Darnell looked at his son's school picture on the fridge. He thought about future nights, about trash bins, about walks, about being boring again. He said, "We take it, but we don't go quiet." When the settlement became public, headlines simplified it. City pays $750,000 after wrongful detention. Officer questioned resident taking out trash. Some people cheered. Some people complained about taxpayer money. Some asked, "Why didn't he just show ID?" That question is always there. It sounds reasonable. It's also the point. Because if the standard becomes show ID to exist, then freedom becomes conditional, and conditional freedom isn't freedom. Darnell and Aisha did one interview. They didn't talk like activists. They talked like parents. Aisha said, "We bought that house because we wanted our son to grow up safe." Darnell said, "I shouldn't have to prove I live in my own home." The reporter asked, "Do you think it was racism?" Darnell paused, then he said, "You tell me what else it was." That line hit social media. Some people shared it, some people mocked it, but nobody could unhear it. And the Bodycam clip, Keen's voice saying, "You don't live here," became a kind of ugly proof. Proof that bias doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks like it's obvious. And the department announced an investigation. They didn't publicly release discipline details. Keen stayed employed for a time. Then later, quietly, he transferred. No dramatic firing, no official statement, just movement. That's another pattern. Systems often respond to scandal by rearranging people instead of transforming culture. But the settlement created a ripple. Neighbors started organizing community meetings. A local civil rights group offered Know Your Rights sessions. The HOA, embarrassed by the attention, softened its tone. And in the department, younger officers watched the footage and saw a warning. Not a warning about crime, a warning about consequences. Because now, in that city, Officers knew that a driveway stop could become a lawsuit, and sometimes that's what change looks like. Not enlightenment, not empathy, just accountability that costs money. For Darnell and Aisha, the aftermath was quieter. They used part of the settlement to pay legal fees. They put some away for Miles. They donated a portion to a foster youth program in the county because they wanted the money to become something else, something useful. They installed better lighting, not because they needed it, because they wanted control back. They got a new trash bin with smoother wheels, a ridiculous detail. But when you're recovering from humiliation, small things become symbols. The first time Darnell took the trash out again, he did it earlier. The sun was still up, kids were playing, neighbors waved, and Darnell still felt his shoulders tense when a car slowed at the corner. Not because he expected trouble, because his body remembered. That's the hidden cost of these moments. Even when you win, your nervous system pays. One night, months later, Miles asked, "If I grow up, will the police think I don't live here too?" Aisha's eyes filled. Darnell stared at his son, and he realized the story wasn't just about one officer, it was about inheritance, the inheritance of suspicion. Darnell sat down with Miles and said, "Some people make wrong assumptions, but you belong anywhere you're supposed to be." Miles asked, "How do they know?" Darnell hesitated, then he answered honestly. "Sometimes they don't," he said. "That's why we keep records. That's why we speak up." He didn't say, "That's why we record," but the implication was there, and that's a hard lesson to pass down. In the end, this story circles back to that first sentence. You don't live here. A sentence that revealed a belief that some people don't belong unless they can prove it, a belief that turns ordinary life into a checkpoint. The $750,000 settlement didn't erase the moment. It didn't give Darnell a time machine. It didn't make his son forget the sight of handcuffs. But it did something important. It forced an institution to pay for an assumption. It forced a city to admit, without saying the words, that something went wrong. And it reminded everyone watching that safe is not a neutral word. Safe can mean protected, or it can mean policed. The difference depends on who you are, and who gets to decide you belong. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If a person can be told they don't belong while taking out their own trash, what does belonging even mean? And what would it take? Policy, culture, accountability, for that sentence to stop coming out of an officer's mouth as if it's obvious. Because the quiet streets of Maple Grove Estates looked peaceful before that patrol car turned the corner. They looked safe. But peace built on someone else's silence isn't peace. It's just quiet. And now, at least in one city, quiet got expensive, which might be the only reason anyone in power will listen. But for Darnell Reed, standing in his driveway under a street lamp, trash bin beside him, the lesson was simpler. You can do everything right. You can buy the house. You can pay the taxes. You can wave at the neighbors. And still, one person's assumption can put metal on your wrists. So you record, you report, you refuse to let it be small. And if you're lucky and relentless, you force the world to admit you were there the whole time, not as a suspect, as a neighbor, as a homeowner, as a human being. And the next time the trash bin rolls over asphalt in the quiet, you remember. Belonging shouldn't require evidence, but in too many places, it still does.
We appreciate you tuning in. If this breakdown helped you understand the situation better, remember to like, share, and subscribe to Justice Insight Cam. Stay aware, stay protected, and we will see you next time.